I want to discuss Buddhism a little bit because for the first time in the Kamakura period, Buddhism officially reaches the common people. And until now, they made attempts to do this, but it never really happened. Now Buddhism is not just for the aristocrats, it's for everybody. And so during this period, you have 4 new sects, 4 new denominations of Buddhism that are developed. And this period is often compared to the Protestant Reformation in Europe, which also makes Christianity very accessible for the common people. The same thing is happening now in Japan. Okay. So the first type of Buddhism is called Pure Land Buddhism. This is developed by a monk named Honen. Okay, and so Honen was actually originally a Tendai monk. He belonged to the Tendai sect of Buddhism, and he lived on Mount Hiei, but he became very, very disillusioned with Tendai Buddhism. He called this old-fashioned Buddhism. He said it's not relevant anymore for us today. So Honen believed in a particular Buddha named the Amida Buddha. Okay, and so in Buddhism, Amida Buddha is considered to be the gatekeeper of heaven. In Buddhism, it's called the Pure Land, or the Heavenly Paradise. So people who reach enlightenment are able to go to the Pure Land and spend eternity there in complete bliss. This is similar to the Christian concept of heaven, and so Amida is the gatekeeper of this Pure Land. So Pure Land Buddhism teaches that if you chant this particular prayer, in Japanese it's Namu Amida Butsu, praise the Amida Buddha, if you chant this over and over again, constantly, all day long, you can reach enlightenment and you can go to the Pure Land. So this was very, very helpful for peasants because peasants didn't know how to read, right? So they couldn't sit and read the Lotus Sutra of Tendai Buddhism or practice the complicated rituals of Shingon Buddhism. They just had to remember this short phrase, Namu Amida Butsu, while they're farming, while they're living their lives, and if you keep chanting it all day long, you could reach Pure Land. So the peasants loved Pure Land Buddhism, and it became very, very popular among the peasants, and sure enough, in the 1250s, a new great Buddha, remember the great Buddha in Nara? A new, but smaller, great Buddha was built in Kamakura in the 1250s. And this great Buddha, as you can see here, is outside. It's modeled after the Amida Buddha. And if you go in the back of the great Buddha, there's a little door, and you can actually walk inside the great Buddha, and there's a little room that's like inside the great Buddha. I recommend that you check it out if you go to Kamakura. It's still standing today. So that was Pure Land Buddhism. There was also something called True Pure Land Buddhism, and this was developed by a monk named Shinran. And Shinran was a disciple of Honen. So True Pure Land is like an offshoot of Pure Land Buddhism. And Shinran is called the Japanese Martin Luther. You might remember Martin Luther from Protestantism, Lutheranism in Germany, in Europe during the Reformation. But Shinran is considered the Japanese Martin Luther because he actually deviated from Buddhist norms. So he was a monk who ate meat. Until now, Buddhists were always vegetarians. And he also married. He married a nun. This was never done in Buddhism. So he really reformed Buddhism in Japan. And one of his adherents, one of Shinran's adherents, Ippen, he believed in true Pure Land Buddhism. So he would assemble people and he would go from province to province in Japan, dancing and chanting Namu Amida Butsu in the villages. So he actually converts 2 million people in the villages, in the provinces, to true Pure Land Buddhism. Ippen really, really makes true Pure Land Buddhism a force to be reckoned with in Japan, really. So Shinran's True Pure Land Buddhism, what's the difference between True Pure Land and Pure Land Buddhism? They're very similar in that they both believe in the Amida Buddha, but while Pure Land Buddhism says you have to keep chanting Namu Amida Butsu over and over again, True Pure Land says if you just say it once, but you really mean it, we can guarantee that you will be enlightened and go to the Pure Land. So you just have to say Namu Amida Butsu one time, just once, and if you say it once, you're guaranteed to be enlightened and go to the Pure Land when you die. So for this reason, this is considered the easiest and most practical form of Buddhism. Okay, and it was actually the main form of Buddhism practiced among the peasants because it was so easy. You just say it one time, you don't have to worry about it. You're guaranteed to go to Pure Land in your afterlife. So even today in Japan, this is the sect of Buddhism that is the most common in Japan, True Pure Land Buddhism. It has the most number of adherents. So there's something about it that really transcends time. And we already discussed Ippen. I accidentally have this slide twice, but he converts over 2 million people in the provinces to true Pure Land Buddhism. And this is a picture. It's a emaki. Remember the picture scrolls? This is a picture scroll that shows Ippen going to the villages and lecturing about true Pure Land and converting people in the provinces to true Pure Land Buddhism. So Pure Land, and namely true Pure Land, were the most popular forms of Buddhism among the peasants. But there's another form of Buddhism that's developed in this time called Nichiren Buddhism, and it's easy because it's developed by a monk named Nichiren. Okay, Nichiren was an interesting fellow because he actually considered himself to be a reincarnation of the Buddha. And his claim to fame was that he actually predicted the Mongol invasions. He went to Kamakura, he met with the Hojo regent, and he said, "We are going to be invaded. This country has declined morally, and we're going to be invaded by the Mongols." And the Hojo at this time said, "What are you talking about? That will never happen." But sure enough, it did. The Mongols did try to conquer Japan. And even though Nichiren was exiled from Kamakura by the Hojo, because he predicted the invasion, this gave Nichiren's type of Buddhism a lot of credibility. So what is Nichiren Buddhism? It's one of the more extreme, outspoken Buddhist sects. And just like Tendai, it believes in the Lotus Sutra, but unlike the Tendai form of Buddhism, Nichiren calls other Buddhist sects and refers to them as being corrupt and vile because they're not as devoted to the Lotus Sutra as they should be. Okay, so it's more extreme in that it says the only real form of Buddhism is Nichiren, and you only have to believe in the Lotus Sutra and nothing else. And unlike the other forms of Buddhism, Nichiren is the only one that is very nationalistic and pro-Japan. It's the only form of Buddhism that was only practiced in Japan. All true Pure Land and Pure Land, they actually were developed in China also, and they happened to come to Japan. But Nichiren is the only one that was developed in Japan, and so it brings the country of Japan into its teachings. So it believes that Japan needs to be cleansed from other Buddhist influences that were more Chinese, like Tendai, like Shingon, like Pure Land and True Pure Land. And they also have a special chant. Pure Land and True Pure Land have Namu Amida Butsu, but Nichiren has Namu Myoho Renge Kyo, All Hail the Lotus Sutra. So this is their own chant. And this is an image of Nichiren. Nichiren Buddhism is still quite popular today. We'll talk a little bit in the end of the course about Soka Gakkai. Maybe you've heard of it. It's another form of Buddhism that was developed more recently that is actually developed from Nichiren Buddhism. Perhaps the most important form of Buddhism in the samurai period is Zen Buddhism. I'm sure you've all heard of Zen, okay? And Zen did not come from Japan or even from China. It was actually developed in India by a priest named Bodhidharma. And from there it went to China, Korea, and then it arrived to Japan during the Kamakura period. So the monks who developed Zen Buddhism in Japan were Eisai and Dogen. Eisai forms the Rinzai sect of Buddhism. Dogen founds the Soto sect of Buddhism. They're very, very similar. There's some minor doctrinal differences, but for the most part, they are very, very similar. We don't need to discuss the differences in this course. They're both forms of Zen Buddhism. And the reason Zen Buddhism is so important in the samurai period is because this was the official Buddhist sect of the shogunate and was the official form of Buddhism practiced by the samurai class. And the reason the samurai loved Zen so much is because it stresses virtue, loyalty, and discipline. And as we just discussed, this is something the samurai class lives by. So it's a great way for them to practice religion and practice these important tenets of discipline and virtue. Zen is responsible for teaching meditation. So if you've heard of anything about meditation, that it all comes from Zen. Meditation is a way of getting past this world of material things and illusion. And if you meditate, you can reach enlightenment. Okay, so unlike other forms of Buddhism, which tell you you have to read the Lotus Sutra, you have to chant this sutra, you have to chant this prayer, Zen tells you that enlightenment is within yourself. Okay, that if you meditate, you can reach enlightenment by yourself without the help of anything or anybody. Okay? And if you're having trouble with that, if you're having trouble meditating, you can find them. You're the disciple. You can find a teacher. You can find a Zen master, and he will help you with meditation. So a way of doing this, for example, a master would give a disciple something called a koan, or a riddle, which doesn't have an easy answer. So for example, an example of a koan would be, what is the sound of one hand clapping? Think about that. Is there a sound? Think about it and meditate about it. And you have to meditate until you find a suitable answer. This is a way to train you to meditate. Okay? And again, Zen is very popular among the samurai class because they don't want to have to rely on anybody. They say if we just have it in ourselves to reach enlightenment, we don't need the help of anyone else or anything else. We can just find enlightenment by ourselves. So because the samurai class and the shoguns loved meditation so much, Zen became the official Buddhist sect of the Kamakura shogunate. Many, many Buddhist temples were built in Kamakura, like Kenchoji Temple, Engakuji Temple. If you go to Kamakura, you can see all these temples, and they were officially built by the Hojo regents. And these temples were actually built in the Chinese architectural style. So they were constructed by Chinese Buddhist monks who escaped to Japan from China after the Mongol invasions. They escaped. So they came to Kamakura and they built all these Zen Buddhist temples.